Right, so it is day 104 of my attempt to plant a new tree for every single day of 2023. And so let's get on with it. Right, so today's planting is one for the chickens. So as the other night I planted a Lychee chinensis just to the southwestern side of their little hutch. Today I'm planting a Carpentaria acuminata, I think. I did look up the second part of the name because I never remember it and I've forgotten it already, just to the southeast side of the hutch. So this is part of a sort of ongoing attempt. So this is part of an ongoing attempt to sort of create a sort of almost circular enclosure around the chicken hutch with plants, with thicket, which should create a nice sort of sheltered environment where they feel a little bit more safe eating and having chicks, and they're less likely to be harassed by predators when they're going up and down the ramp into the hen house. So the trouble with that is the chickens themselves, they do tend to kick things to death. So it's quite good to have palms, because palms tend to transplant quite well at a relatively large size compared to a lot of other plants. That is not true of a lot of the native palms, but it is true of a lot of things like the queen palms and the Cuban royal palms and palms like today's Carpentarias. So this is already large enough that it shouldn't be at serious risk from the chickens themselves. So this doesn't really need a companion plant of its own because it's going in on the edge of my thicket, which is an area of sort of dense mixed planting with a lot of the plants that I feel need a little bit of irrigation throughout the year. And because of that, we've got an awful lot of very different toxins around, so it doesn't really need any chemical protection, and because it's large enough, it doesn't really need any physical protection, and it's in a fairly sheltered area, which is particularly appropriate for a Carpentaria, which means that it doesn't really need ground cover to shelter the ground. It is getting the ground cover in the form of what I think is Sansevieria pearsoni. It should probably now be referred to as Dracaena, because I believe Sansevieria is generally considered to be a sort of scattered through Dracaena these days, rather than a genus in its own right. But it's one of the native ones. I will pop the name up on screen. Now that's going there because where it was had become just a bit too dense for it, because it's very happy with the shade, but it's not very happy to be enclosed and getting very little air movement. And one of the Gmelinas, the Azekau, which I planted quite a lot of a while ago, and somewhat regretting that, was starting to choke out where this was growing, and so I've moved it along, so it should do a little bit better in more light here, and then once the thicket expands a bit more, we will move that again. The Carpentaria won't need moving because the Carpentaria is perfect for a shady environment. So this is a rainforest tree, and you can sort of see its natural habitat in its growth form. It's a very, very slender palm. Even very tall ones tend to have incredibly thin trunks, which means they really rely on the support of other trees around them, and they really do quite well in very sheltered environments where there's not so much wind, where there's not so much exposure, and they grow very, very high, so they eventually reach the sunlight even in a very closed environment. But the important part is that their trunk is quite well sheltered from heavy wind, from the worst of the elements in that situation. It's not a particularly useful palm in its own, aside from being scaffolding for a lot of the climbers that I might want to plant here in the end, but it is very nice in that it attracts a lot of fruit bats, so its fruit is very, very attracted to fruit bats and certain fruit-eating birds, and that should really help fruit bats bring the seeds of other fruiting trees in. And if it's going into a nice hyperdense environment like this, a lot of the rare fruit tree seeds should germinate quite well and should come up and then be either transplanted elsewhere or retained in this location as part of this ever-growing thicket. Right, so that should be everything for today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you didn't, well done for watching to this point anyway. Please tune in again tomorrow when I will be planting yet another tree. Hang on, we have to get this. This is a Malbrook, which is one of the native monkeys. They're quite difficult to tell apart from the other vervets, and they were included in the same species until genetic separation that took them apart. You can tell from the way he is sitting that he is male, because you can see a little bit of blue at the rear end there, and that is his gentleman's relish, as it were. Now this is a solitary male, which is what quite often happens around town, so you will get the males that are a little bit too old to stay in their troop, are sort of kicked out, and there's not really other troops are available for them, and if there's not enough females around to go off and start their own troop, they will then wander off and find somewhere quiet to live by themselves until they're big enough and ugly enough to try and take over someone else's troop. he has been very, very well behaved. He has occasionally worked the dogs up a bit, but he's never come down and caused any trouble. In fact, he's been quite a pleasant little guest, and he just likes to spend a lot of his time eating palm fruits and bundu beans and occasionally guavas and mangoes. And generally speaking, I'm quite pleased to have him around so far. They can become very much a nuisance, especially if they start to try and take food directly from people. But generally speaking, he has not been coming close enough for that to be a problem, and we just need to make sure we don't actively feed him, and he should remain well behaved. I did actually film a little bit to include yesterday on what custard apples look like, but I forgot to include it, so here it is instead. So this is more or less full grown for this tree. It will be significantly larger once the tree itself is larger. Annona squamosa. So yeah, you can see it is still very, very solid. It is a very alien looking fruit. The skin itself will not be edible, so it will be, once it's ripe, you'll cut that in half and you'll have this soft custardy fruit inside there. So yeah, custard apple.